Let's focus on now on the industrial era with regards to our overview of the crime and punishment. So, historical context. Let's have a look. So, here we know that Britain industrialised during this era of 1750 to 1900 and it became known as the workshop of the world. This industrialisation led to considerable transformational changes across the country. We know that this mass migration from the countryside to towns and cities took place. We know the landscape was transformed due to the factories and chimneys, etc. And this era of the golden age of the railway development across the country also took place, and that will help us to understand some of the changes in crime. Don't forget there was this significant population boom. In 1750, the population was approximately 6 million, whereas just 150 years later, you've got a population of 37 million. That too will help us to understand the problems of this era when it comes to overcrowding and things like that. And ultimately, steam power transformed technology. And as always, the crimes and enforcement are inextricably linked to the changes that were going on during this period. Now, in terms of prevailing attitudes at the time, we have a large element of continuity here. Ret and det continued. So in terms of retribution and deterrence, that largely continued. But remember that this was moving into the period of Enlightenment, a period in European and world history where new ideas about art, maths, science, how people lived, people came up with new ideas. And some attitudes began to change with regards to looking at punishment in terms of retribution and deterrence. There were some people like John Glyde. He said that crime was as a result of the environment in which people lived. So we will begin to see a softening of attitudes towards things like hanging, but it wasn't a transformational change, and significant changes didn't happen until middle or early part of the 20th century. Moving on. Let's have a look at some of the types of crimes. We have, yet again, continuity in terms of those traditional crimes, such as theft, rape and violence, etc. But murder actually went down. Some historians put this due to how the police was beginning to form during this period. And there were changes, there were new types of crime linked to the context and changes of this period. We know that there was a massive problem of overcrowding. And because it was so crowded, it led to many, many instances of theft and pickpocketing. We also know that the new crime of embezzlement began to form during this era, and this is known as white-collar crime. And the instance I used in class is that if there was a business that had been set up and it had some investment, instead of money from a bank, it might be from investors, well, the criminal would fiddle the books to make it look as though the company was doing worse than intended, and the investors would lose their investment of potentially significant sums. That's embezzlement, white-collar crime. In addition to that, we had a lot of theft of middle-class homes and of businesses like the factories where they produce things. And there was even crime around the theft of clean water from middle-class premises. Because of overcrowding, sanitation was very, very poor during this period. It led to massive social problems. So theft of clean water from those middle-class era people. And also other crimes like not paying on the trains was also common. So just moving on from that, we've got the types of punishment. Now, again, continuity, hanging was still in place, but there were more humane forms of hanging, believe it or not, even though with regards to it's seen nowadays as not being very humane. But they introduced this notion of the new drop. And the new drop is that in order to kill the person much more quickly and therefore humanely, they would step on like a trapdoor, and it might break their neck and kill them. And then in addition to that, we've got the long drop. So a calculation was made with regards to how long the rope should be in accordance to the criminal's height and weight, and that would also help them to die very much quickly. Then we've got, due to the more humanitarian views of the Enlightenment period, the humanitarian views, attitudes beginning to soften somewhat, not in all areas, but in some areas. This period of the Enlightenment, this may have led to less hangings, because less hangings certainly did take place. Sir Robert Peel, remember he is the Home Secretary at the time, Sir Robert Peel made the changes away from the Bloody Code, and he stated that only murder and attempted murder could lead to capital punishment and treason, of course, but only murder and attempted murder. Public hangings were banned because they were seen as a form of entertainment, and the government didn't want to be associated with that, so that was changed. And don't forget, we've got this new punishment of transportation to the first instance America until 1776. That was because America gained independence from the British Empire, and then from 1776 they went to Australia. This was frowned upon and caused a lot of controversy because it would take months and months to get to Australia, and up to a fifth of the criminals would die. So that ultimately stopped because it was seen as being inhumane. We've also got, during this period, new punishments like the tread wheel and corporal punishment like the cat o' nine tails and the crank, etc. during this period. So we've got a lot of corporal punishment during the period. And then finally, due to enforcement, we've got the beginning of the police force. So in the 1750s, we've got the Bow Street Runners, and the Bow Street Runners were volunteers, and that was the early form of a professional police force. And it wasn't until 1829, however, that Sir Robert Peel, as mentioned earlier, the Home Secretary at the time, he set up the London Metropolitan Police, and that involved 3,000 policemen paid for by the government. And this was a substantial change during the period because it was seen as a movement away from laissez-faire. This is the government now actually interfering with the safety of ordinary people's lives. Many people criticised that and said that the police shouldn't be paid, taxes shouldn't be paid to protect ordinary people. So this is significant because it's a movement away from that concept of laissez-faire. And then finally, there was prison reform throughout this period. And that prison reform first started around 1816 when you had the first national prison. JPs also, the Justice of the Peace, visited prisons to report on conditions, and there were new laws introduced saying things like women and men had to be in separate prisons. So there's a lot going on during this period, so it's important that we're able to remember those key aspects because many of the questions, in fact all the questions, are knowledge based for the exam.